Part 1 of this video series, we showed you how to disassemble the bell housing from the transmission case and removing its clutch drum for inspection. We are now going to continue this video by disassembling the clutch pack inside the transmission housing for inspection on transmission performance status. In the video description, you will see a link on how to remove this front pump oil seal from the transmission bell housing. With the transmission partially disassembled, it's much easier for lifting on the ground, placing onto the table. With all these parts disassembled, you just don't want to place them on the table like this. You want to also disconnect this tail shaft housing for disassembly. So all those parts that's going to come out of the transmission want to be placed in a Ziploc bag to prevent dust and corrosion from building up. Here's a few extra bags for the additional parts that has to be removed. Let's go ahead and remove this sensor. This is the output shaft speed sensor, and it's not required disassembling. But since this is a used transmission, we want to make sure we visual inspect all of the parts, internal and external. Even the electronic component has to be tested with a multivoltmeter on its ohm setting for resistance and verify with the factory manual. Let's proceed to removing the wiring harness. Disconnecting of the hose wiring harness is also important for cleaning the transmission case, and during the course of doing so, you want to make sure you take the ultimate care when pulling on the wire. You want to make sure you don't break them from inside of the socket or cause any broken pieces. So at the tail of the transmission, this sensor that's being removed right now is the VSS, vehicle speed sensor, for miles per hour. It is not necessary to remove this sensor, but we must remove it for inspection like we have mentioned before. This sensor will have to be removed once the tail housing is detached from the transmission clutch case. Successfully disconnect that tail housing. I have to flip this transmission over and remove the transmission mount, and you'll see there's a bracket there with it. Removal of the transmission mount, which is a rubber mount fitted to a bracket, is necessary, and this will have to be done with a 17mm half-inch drive socket on a power bar. Once this mount is removed, a careful visual inspection must be taken at its rubber section, making sure that it's not cracked or separated. If this mount should fail, it will have an effect on the drive shaft universal joint. So it is very important that this motor mount or transmission mount, which is similar, is in rigid condition. And it's something you want to make sure you replace with a factory OEM parts. With a 12mm half-inch drive socket on an extension, we will remove these additional bolts at the lower half of the transmission tail shaft housing. Pay careful attention to these bolts because a few of them, actually two of them, is longer than the ones on the bottom, and those two are the ones that are holding the transmission harness bracket to the tail shaft housing. So there you can see that's a short bolt, and this is another short bolt coming out. So we have three short bolts, and this is going to be a long one that's holding that harness bracket. See, that one is more long. So that's the long bolt for the harness bracket, and the other 3 is for the transmission rear housing. It's time to remove the additional bolts. This will be a long bolt that's holding the harness bracket. Also, the other ones will be identical to these holding the harness bracket. You have to pay careful attention to the length of the bolt that you are removing. Failure to do so may cause a long bolt to install in a short hole, damaging the aluminum threads, and basically sometime it will crack the aluminum casting. So you must remember the length of the bolt and where they came from in disassembling. So all these bolts are equal length. So we only have 3 short bolts, and all the other ones are long 12mm bolts. And the threads are something you're going to have to get specification on. Now this transmission, like I said before, you see these bolts, they're equal length and also long. This transmission is a used unit, and the person that we purchased it from, we have lost credibility in that salesman because basically lied to us about this unit. This is why we're taking it apart, to make sure that it is a valid transmission and it will work properly when it's installed in the vehicle. We don't want to install this transmission in the vehicle and then find out it's not working, and then we have to take it out and rebuild it again. That's a lot of work. Alright, now we have to detach this tail shaft housing. With a rubber mallet, just want to strike the aluminum, separating that tail shaft housing, saving that gasket joint. Want to look inside there, make sure you don't have any foreign objects, any parts, any broken pieces. So this is the output shaft rotating right here. That's the paw gear. So this fell from the inside of the clutch. We're going to look at that. But this is the paw gear that locks the transmission. Let's turn the transmission around, and we want to look at the internal. That's a Planetary, and this is the Planetary shell. We have to look at these gears, making sure that they're not compressed. We want to fit this back, rotating it, make sure it rotates smooth. It does not have any lash to it or any clearance. Now we're going to place this input shaft in. You see, when we rotate the input shaft clockwise, the output shaft rotates counterclockwise. So that's verifying our installation. Now we want to take a look at these sprockets, these gears, making sure they're in very good condition. No compression or wear and tear should be on the gear or any broken pieces. All inside of the Planetary, you will see there is additional gears. There's 3 gears. There's a needle roller bearing. That's a thrust bearing. This sometime has to be replaced if it shows evidence of excessive wear and tear. We want to look at all these gears inside, taking out the Planetary. See, this is another gear for the inside. All these have to be carefully inspected during the process of cleaning. Okay, now we want to remove this Planetary shell. This Planetary shell is going to require unlocking of the C-clip from the paw gear, also known as the parking gear. This is the gear that locks the transmission in park. You see there's a C-clip that has to be detached for removing that park or paw gear, so this output shaft can be removed. This is going to become difficult, and you're going to want to use care here, making sure you don't expand the C-clamp beyond its limitation, because when placing it back, you're going to need it to clamp onto the spline holding that paw gear in position. Okay, we were successful at getting this C-clip off. It's not easy, but that's what it looks like. Now that we have the clip off, the park gear can be removed. There's a washer on the reverse side. Okay, now that we have that paw gear removed, this is going to allow us to push the input shaft forward for releasing of another C-clip inside on this Planetary shell. So we're going to take a closer look in on this Planetary so you can see the C-clip that has to be removed. Okay, so that's the C-clip holding on to the output shaft, and that thrust bearing will also need inspection. So that's the C-clip that require removal. Now we could detach this Planetary shell, taking careful inspection of the back, all the gears, making sure the gears are not compressed, broken, or worn out. Also want to look at the back where all the bearings are located, making sure everything is up to factory specification. All this ring gear has to be in perfect condition. So this is a spacer washer, and those holes are for these lug to fit into. That's our thrust washer. Let's go ahead and remove this output shaft. So that's the output shaft. We have to compare this output shaft with a 4x4 transmission output shaft to see if they're identical. Let's remove another. This is our Planetary for the clutch drum. This is a thrust washer. All the gears. Careful inspection have to be taken. We're going to take another inspection look at all these parts during the process of cleaning them out with kerosene. So we always want to fit the parts together when we're going to place them to the side so we don't miss any pieces. You see all those brown clutch liners, all those tooth, well, it has to interlock with this outer shell spline. You see the spline on the outside has to lock with those clutch when you're sitting it back in position. We want to lift this drum out of the transmission case. So rotating the transmission, you will notice these 6 grade 8 Torx bolt. This is a T45 that's required for removal. So when we take a look at the tool, you can see the manufacturer didn't even take the time for labeling the tool with the proper size. And since we are using a glove, it's not going to be likely for us to grab this tool when turning because it does not has any traction to it. Well, that's the tool manufacturer. Sometimes they're not mechanics themselves, they're just designers. So you're going to know good mechanic tools when you see them because they're easier to work with. You see, most of the time a mechanic is going to be working amount oil, and that's going to create a slippery condition. So the manufacturer of the tool will know exactly where to place a rough surface so the hands can gain traction for turning and twisting that tool. With this tool, it's most difficult for turning with a oily glove. So you have to look for all these things when you're purchasing tools because it's the tool that makes your work, installation and disassemble easy, simple, and trouble-free. Removal of that last drum will require unbolting with a T45 Torx, removing these grade 8 bolts holding the drum against the aluminum casting. Eventually, this transmission will be transformed into a 4x4 transmission by eliminating its tail shaft housing and installing a output shaft from the 4x4 transmission into this transmission. In some case, a transmission that's non-4x4 will not bolt up to a 4x4 transmission transfer case. So this is our last drum removed. This is a sprag. It allows one-way rotation of the assembly. Let's take another look in there. We can see this is our piston spring. We have a set of clutches and steel liner that has to be removed from inside the aluminum casting. These clutch liners and steel plates are just fitted into these slots. You see the slots all around the edges. But first we have to take that C-clip out. There's a big C-clip that holds the clutch pack into the transmission case housing. This is not a drum, this is the transmission case itself. Alright, with the C-clip removed, now we can remove all these clutch pack. So this is the seat for the clutch pack. And we want to look at the surface of this steel, making sure there's no discoloration, no darkness, no corrosion, no uneven. With a perfect, clean surface, this is a sign that the clutch is in good condition. Like you can see, it still has all the grooves in the plates. You see those lines? Well, that's a sign that this is a very good clutch plate. If this clutch plate was worn out, you wouldn't see those lines on its clutch fiber. This is another steel plate, and we want to inspect all these parts, making sure there's no discoloration where the wet clutch is seat against the steel plate. Here's another clutch that looks identical to the one we just removed, and all of them is the same. So this is basically confirmed that this transmission is in absolutely good working condition, and the oil is simply just a misleading evidence for thinking that the transmission is total. Now with the transmission disassembled, we clean the internal without removing the valve body. This is something we're going to want to do when the transmission is in the vehicle. During the process of test driving, if we feel that the valve body needs servicing, it can be done from under the vehicle. So we will just service the clutch pack, steel lining, seal, piston seal, and all the necessary O-rings before installing. So this is the complete set of clutch. You can see there's a clutch, steel liner, clutch, steel liner, a clutch, steel liner, clutch, steel liner, clutch, steel liner, and this is a dampener plate. That's to absorb the impact from shifting. So that's first gear clutch pack. And first gear is the most used gear. That is why we have more clutch packs and steel liner to endure shifting in stop and go condition. These holes are all pressure passageway from the pump to the valve body. Let's take a careful look inside the transmission, making sure there's no crack or missing pieces or broken. Here is the valve body that can be detached. That's the shifter, and it controls. You see this linkage in here. That linkage is connected to that rod. You see this rod. Now this rod is what engages onto that paw gear for locking the transmission. Let's go ahead and clean this unit up. This is the last wet clutch drum that was removed. And what I want to show you is the rotation of this sprag. It rotates in one way, which is a normal condition, and it just basically breaks on the other way. When you remove it, you're going to see a set of roller bearing, and below that is some bushing where these three seals have to be seated perfectly against. There is also a thrust bearing that require inspection before assemble. You can see that thrust bearing right there. So we're going to fit this all together to be clean and reassembled with lubricant. With the clutch assembly completely disassembled, we're going to wait for removing the valve body when the transmission is in the vehicle. But now is when we want to clean the exterior and the interior of the transmission, allowing it to dry for reassemble. Also, the parts that we have placed in these plastic bags has to be cleaned, disassembled, and inspected. All the seals, the clutches, this is the output shaft, that's the input shaft, all placed in plastic bag to prevent corrosion. And also, if you have people around you, you don't want them to start taking parts away from your assembly. Safety first. Always protect the parts. Let's go clean this transmission. Here we will notice the damaged wiring harness closely up against its plug, and will most likely need replacement for the whole complete harness and the plug. So this part will have to come out of the 4x4 transmission and be installed into this transmission. We cannot use this piece anymore because it's not communicating with these number 1, 2, 3, and 4 solenoid for shifting. These solenoid open up hydraulic passageway inside the transmission for shifting the clutch back. Once we finish cleaning this unit up, then we could take a visual inspection of the 4x4 transmission output shaft spline, and then we could use that spline shaft for rebuilding this transmission, because it will have to accept a transfer case for 4x4 drive. That's the tail. Most likely will not be reused. This is the end. Thank you for watching the video.